Good morning. Hi, I'm Ray Williams, the Blanton Museum's Director of Education and Academic Affairs. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of our director, Simone Witcha, our Deputy Director, Carter Foster, who would have been here except he had to make a sudden out-of-town trip. But I'm delighted to welcome you. We're going to have a great day thinking about Leo Steinberg and Prints and how important they are to our understanding of art history. So welcome to our symposium, Leo Steinberg, Collector, Critic, and Scholar. It's designed to bring together art historians who will share with you their assessment of Steinberg's scholarship and legacy in relation to Prints. The symposium is held in conjunction with our special exhibition, After Michelangelo Passed Picasso, Leo Steinberg's Library of Prints. It's up at the Blanton through May 9th. And if you're local, I really hope you'll come see this exhibition. It is so beautifully organized. And I have to say that my curatorial colleagues, led by Holly Borum, did a fantastic job with the writing. It is just, it answers all the questions you want to know and really takes you through a complicated argument, but made so accessible through elegant and clear writing. If you're not local, you can look forward to a catalog forthcoming in the spring of 2022, which will have essays by Holly Borum, Peter Parshall, and Jonathan Bober. Funding for the exhibition from the Getty Foundation through the Paper Project, with additional support from Leslie Shanti and Robert Topp, the Skurlock Foundation Exhibition Endowment, and the IFPDA Foundation. We're also pleased to announce that a digital tour with an audio guide is now available on our website. As for today's program, there will be 2 talks, which our speakers have pre-recorded, followed by a live Q&A. After a half-hour break, we'll have 2 more talks with time for questions again at the end. And now, just a few housekeeping notes. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you. And we'll be taking your questions from the Q&A window. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, including one labeled Q&A. Click on that to type and send your questions, not the chat. We'll wait and hold the Q&A for both speakers after the second talk, so you will have plenty of time to submit your questions. And now Ginevra Higginson, Curatorial Assistant in Prints and Drawings, will now introduce our speakers and moderate the Q&A.
Hello, thank you, Ray. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am Ginevra, and it is my honor to introduce our first speaker, Holly Borum. She is the Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Blanton Museum of Art, where she oversees the Julia Matthews Wilkinson Center for Prints and Drawings. At the Blanton, she curated copies, fakes, and reproductions, printmaking in the Renaissance, and coordinated the traveling exhibition, Medieval Monsters, Terrors, Aliens, Wonders. Her exhibition, After Michelangelo Passed Picasso, Leo Steinberg's Library of Prints, is on view at the Blanton from February 7th to May 9th, and she earned her PhD in Art and Archaeology from Princeton University, where she also interned at the Princeton University Art Museum. Holly, could you say a quick hello, please?
Good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for coming.
Great. I will introduce Jennifer after Holly's talk, but for now, let's get started.
Good morning. Let me begin with a few words of thanks to those who have made this symposium and the related exhibition possible. I am grateful to the whole team at the Blanton: curatorial, collections, exhibitions, marketing, development, education, and security departments, for helping put together and present a really beautiful and really large show in the midst of closures, reopenings, reconfigurations, and the general mayhem that all of us have been living with for the last year. A special thanks as well to Leo Steinberg's friends and colleagues who have been very gracious with their time and insights as I did the research for this exhibition. In his opening remarks, Ray mentioned our generous sources of funding, to which I'll add a Getty Library Research grant was also instrumental in helping me put together this show. And frankly, many of you on this Zoom have offered suggestions and advice that helped shape the exhibition and today's program. You know who you are, and many thanks. I'd also like to start off by acknowledging that this is an unusual type of program. Not only is it the first ever digital scholarly symposium at the Blanton, but it is also unusual in its slate of speakers and likely participant viewers. To be honest, we are in rather mixed company. At academic conferences, it is not so typical for scholars of 20th century art to be seated, even virtually, next to scholars of the Renaissance. It has taken quite an exceptional figure, Leo Steinberg, to draw us here together. For the modernists among us, Steinberg is best known for his formulation of the flatbed picture plane and his championing of other criteria by which to evaluate the art he encountered in New York's galleries in the late 1950s through the 1960s. Steinberg's article, The Philosophical Brothel on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, was groundbreaking and will be republished in a volume of his collected Picasso essays next year. Art historians of the early modern period know Steinberg for his provocative thesis about the sexuality of Christ in Renaissance art, as well as his deep engagement with the paintings and sculptures of Michelangelo, recently republished in 2 collected volumes, among other old masters, also recently republished in a collected volume, and for his incredibly thorough, almost relentless study of Leonardo's Last Supper. Preceding all these studies was his dissertation on the Roman Church of San Carlino, which remains among the definitive works on the Baroque architect Borromini. Among these wide-ranging publications on artists of the early modern, and, in a term he coined, postmodernist periods, Steinberg addressed a broad array of media: architecture, painting, and sculpture. For all the ground he covered, Steinberg is not, however, thought of as a print scholar. That is, someone whose primary focus is prints, whether through connoisseurship, the study of their social role, or both. His contributions to the field of print scholarship remain largely buried in specialist publications, such as the Print Collector's Newsletter. But perhaps instead of buried, we should consider that Steinberg's work on prints is fundamentally embedded in his arguments about other artworks. Beginning with his 1960 dissertation, virtually every Steinberg publication and lecture includes prints as visual evidence. Though not their only purpose, the more than 6,700 prints Steinberg acquired over the course of 5 decades served as primary source documents for his scholarship. They formed a private library, supplying Steinberg with information akin to the books on his shelf. As argued in the exhibition, the entrance to which we see here, and as I will elaborate on this morning, Steinberg's collection and study of prints allowed him to trace very specific chains of artistic influence, provided him with a rich iconographical bank of images, furnished contemporaneous art criticism through corrective copies, and even supplied him with the vocabulary to challenge reigning orthodoxies about 20th century art. Print scholarship thus owes Steinberg a debt for the creative ways he embedded the study of prints within the larger art historical discourse. But first, a few words about how Steinberg came to collect and study prints. While a graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts in the late 1950s, he purchased and received a few prints as gifts, the first of which actually came from his close friend, Daisy Barr, wife of MoMA director Alfred Barr. The decisive event that transformed Steinberg's initial curiosity about prints into a sustained, lifelong pursuit was a nearly fatal one. Steinberg had a heart attack in the spring of 1961 at age 40. The doctor told him to take it easy for the next few months until he started his first teaching position at Hunter College in New York. For Steinberg, this meant foregoing a strenuous summer of library research, or perhaps European travel, in favor of scurrying around New York's galleries, print shops, frame shops, and bookstores on the hunt for more and more prints. In fact, as Steinberg's meticulously annotated ledgers indicate, he didn't even wait until he was discharged from the hospital to begin his summer purchasing spree. He bought a print from a Lucian Goldsmith catalog, quote, "sight unseen from my hospital bed." Within 1 year, Steinberg amassed over 700 prints, paying often just a few dollars per work. In the summers, he visited Paris and London, where he established relationships with dealers, from whom he received print catalogs during the year. Among his sources in London were the antique dealer Louis Meyer and the bookseller E. Seligman, whose Cecil Court shop fronts we see here in an undated photograph. Lured in by the combination of high aesthetic value and low cost, Steinberg purchased the bulk of his collection between 1961 and 1969, at a time when high-quality, old master European prints were still plentiful and affordable. His collection ranges from the 15th through the 20th century, with a strong emphasis on the 16th and 17th centuries. As prices began to rise in the 1980s, Steinberg's collecting pace slowed, though he continued buying, selling, and trading pretty much right up until 2002. When, through the efforts of then Blanton curator Jonathan Bober, the collection came to the University of Texas at Austin. Why did Steinberg take up this hobby? Not only was it a potentially lucrative one, for Steinberg certainly kept careful track of the changing value of his prints, but as he explained, if you're going to do art history, you'd better know what your artists were looking at, and that has to include prints. In his evocative formulation, prints served as the circulating lifeblood of ideas. Previously hidden connections across centuries and geographic boundaries became clear as he, for example, happened upon a hand-colored Currier and Ives lithograph at a shop in Southampton, New York, in which he recognized the Daniele de Volterra model that he had purchased the year before. Subsequently, he came across an engraving of the Deposition after Jean Jouvenet, which Currier and Ives had spliced onto the bottom half of their composition. In the exhibition, arrows and vinyl reproductions of non-Steinberg works elucidate these connections. Steinberg published some of the circulations he discovered in an essay titled The Glorious Company, and posthumously in the article What I Like About Prints, which was based on a lecture he gave at the Blanton when his collection was acquired. Steinberg noted other of these circulations in his ledgers or on his mat notes preserved in the Blanton object files. As in the case of Correggio's Cupid, who, observed and drawn by Peter Paul Rubens on a trip to Mantua, reappears to hold up Venus's mirror in this etching by Peneels after a Rubens painting. The same figure also floats at the top of a cascade of cherubs framing a statue of Ceres in Rubens' painting at the Hermitage. Swiss-German printmaker Matthias Merian repurposed this composition as a title page for diplomat Johann Angelius Verdenhagen's text on the history of the Hanseatic cities. Thus, within 125 years, Correggio's Cupid flitted from Italy to Antwerp to Germany, transforming from paint into 2 printed iterations. The exhibition illustrates 10 such chains of transmission across print, drawing, paint, tapestry, and maiolica. Artists look at other artists, and with print they were no longer limited by geography. As a trained artist himself, who initially taught life drawing at Parsons after immigrating to New York in 1945, Steinberg was incredibly attuned to the human figure. And he recognized that prints could serve as entries in the encyclopedia of postures he was assembling in his image files. Among his papers now at the Getty Research Institute are clippings, postcards, reproductions, Steinberg's own sketches, and notes gathered under headings such as Head Thrown Back, or, as in the example here, Chin Chuck. In Michelangelo, Steinberg found an artist who seemed similarly devoted to the expressive potential of the human figure. As Steinberg proclaimed, in Michelangelo's hands, anatomy becomes theology. By interpreting the spiritual through the corporeal, Steinberg decoded the symbolic import of various poses in Michelangelo's paintings and sculptures, giving considerable attention to depictions of the Virgin and her Son. In the Medici Madonna, for example, Steinberg reads Mary's crossed legs as symbolic of her virginity. Steinberg traces this posture back to ancient Greek representations of the chaste Penelope who waits for the return of her husband Odysseus, and argues that artists before and after Michelangelo continue to deploy the crossed-legged posture for women who must assert their virtue. In one such example from Steinberg's collection, Susanna's innocence, threatened by lecherous men, is signified by her crossed legs. In contrast, parted legs can visualize a child issuing from the mother's womb, a configuration Steinberg terms manifest filiation. Though not unique to Michelangelo, as seen in Léon Davant's etching, nor to this holy pair, as evinced by Veneziano's Cupid and Venus engraving, Michelangelo employs the posture here to join Christ's death with his birth from Mary's womb, as he slumps between her parted legs. As evident from this particular engraving, Steinberg's collecting priorities were not entirely dictated by impression quality or condition. He recognized and appreciated beautiful impressions, but subject matter was of even greater importance to him. Steinberg's attention to the depiction of Christ's physical body led him to his controversial thesis presented in The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Modern Oblivion. Again, paying attention to gestures, such as St. Anne's genital manipulation of her grandson in Hans Baldung-Green's Holy Family woodcut, Steinberg argued that rather than mere naturalism, the attention drawn by artists to Christ's penis was an authentication of Christ's manhood, a proposition buttressed by copious visual sources and exegetical texts. Many prints in Steinberg's collection similarly document his thesis. Whether protectively touched by a mother with foreknowledge of her son's corporeal suffering, at the center of a composition and canopied by a confluence of gestures, or exposed and echoed by a multitude of pointing fingers, the focus on Christ's genitals becomes a guarantee of his human nature. If prints served as entries in his Encyclopedia of Body Language, they could also be understood as revised versions of a first edition, or in Steinberg's terminology as corrective copies. As Steinberg explains, copyists look harder, observe by the inch, and where they refuse to follow the model, follow an alternative, usually critical impulse. The alterations reveal what a closely engaged contemporary admired or censured in the model, or chose to omit. In a field that lionizes originality and has historically disparaged reproductive engraving, Steinberg's valorization of copies and the artists who made them was radical and led to some of his most important insights. The aesthetic quality of the copy was not of prime importance. In fact, Steinberg begins the first chapter of his book on Leonardo's Last Supper by describing a rare engraved copy that he characterizes as inaccurate and naive. Despite these shortcomings, the significance of the print attributed to Giovanni Pietro da Biraggio is hard to overstate. It is the first known instance in which a painting is immediately reproduced in print, and thus is a watershed in the accelerating circulation of images. And like many of the other corrective copies that succeeded, Biraggio's version reduces the scene to a single moment by attaching to the table a notice bearing the text, "One of you will betray me," on an artwork that Steinberg reads multivalently. Along with the literature on the fresco, Steinberg analyzes 49 copies, from Biraggio's engraving to a 19th century mosaic, that he considers significant for understanding this complex painting, so assailed by time, decay, and botched restorations. While copies have always played an outsized role in the study of the Last Supper because of its almost immediate deterioration and the obliteration of its lower central portion by a doorway added in 1652, Steinberg regards the reproductions as more than mere records of lost visual information. Beginning with the question of which narrative moment Leonardo depicts. Is it when Christ announced that one of his disciples will betray him? Or immediately after, when the disciples wonder who it is? Or when Christ identifies the betrayer as the one who dips his hand in the dish? Or the moment when Christ institutes the Eucharist? Steinberg makes painstaking comparisons between Leonardo's version and the multitude of copies to investigate the consequences of the copyist's alterations. Ultimately, he concludes that while Leonardo's fresco is willfully ambiguous about its subject, the copyists reduce it to a single meaning. Among the many reproductive prints in Steinberg's collection, 3 contributed substantially to his analysis of Leonardo's original. Steinberg describes Raphael's design, engraved by Marcantonio Raimondi, as both homage and critique. The artist whom Steinberg characterizes as the great clarifier rotates both of Christ's palms downward and gives him an emphatically closed mouth, thus clearly portraying the moment after Christ has finished speaking. Steinberg equivocates, however, as to whether Christ has just announced his betrayal or the institution of the Eucharist. Some 300 years later, Raphael Morgan's print focuses on the psychological turmoil induced by Christ's prediction of betrayal, which is given explicit textual form through the Latin caption below. Morgan's print removes the wine glass at Christ's right hand, thus erasing the Eucharistic meaning. It was this engraving, not the original fresco, which Goethe relied upon when penning his influential judgment that Leonardo presents an ethical rather than a religious drama. In diametric opposition, Saltmann's etching after Rubens clears the table except for the bread and wine, rendering the sacramental paramount. The engraved biblical captions reference the institution of the Eucharist, confirming that Rubens understood the disciples' agitated reactions as responses to the concept of transubstantiation. Steinberg further deploys the Rubens print as evidence for his argument about the site specificity of Leonardo's fresco. Rubens' relocation of the event to a darkened room with dramatic curtains establishes that the scale and perspective of Leonardo's background only made sense in situ, as both the upper room described in the biblical narrative and an extension of the Milanese refectory. Along with the evidence garnered from variant copies, Steinberg scrutinizes all the figures and their poses, the geometries within the mural, and its placement within the refectory to find coincident opposites throughout Leonardo's entire composition, all of which converge in and emanate from the dual divine-human nature of Christ. No copyist could replicate the complexity of Leonardo's fresco, but each of their attempts illuminate facets of the artist's multivalent program. Corrective copies were similarly fruitful in Steinberg's analyses of Michelangelo's frescoes in the Vatican's Sistine and Pauline chapels. Because our afternoon speaker, Bernadine Barnes, will address Steinberg's use of print to interpret the works of Michelangelo, I won't go into detail about the Vatican frescoes, but will mention that Steinberg's collection includes 36 reproductions of them. In some cases, the prints were simply useful as close-ups, because the frescoes were dirty and hard to see, but in other cases, Steinberg identified corrections that he claimed altered Michelangelo's intended meaning. Steinberg posits that subsequent engravers intentionally changed the fresco's proportions, giving greater emphasis to hell and disrupting a consequential diagonal line that links hell at the lower right to the cross at upper left, in order to obscure what Steinberg calls Michelangelo's merciful heresy. This was done because subsequent church doctrine condemned Michelangelo's view that hell was not eternal. In the James Cole example at right, the print has been Protestantized with the removal of the Virgin Mary, thus making it appropriate for an Anglican audience. By working back and forth from original to copy, while paying close attention to bodily posture, Steinberg sifted out artistic decisions that seem self-evident on their face, but less so when considered against their reproductions. Turning finally to Steinberg's engagement with 20th century art, prints provide fodder for his refutation of critic Clement Greenberg's judgment that a successful work of art must reference its own material construction, which, for two-dimensional media like painting and printmaking, meant acknowledging the flat plane of the canvas and paper as such. In his seminal essay, Other Criteria, developed from a 1968 lecture at MoMA, Steinberg objects to Greenberg's preventative aesthetics that presumed to tell artists what direction their work must take. Steinberg also objected to the critic's assertion that the blending of flatness and illusionism in Cubist works by Picasso and Braque represented a watershed in modern art. Prints in his own collection support Steinberg's contention that artists have been drawing attention to the flatness of their page for centuries, purposely juxtaposing it with illusionism for complex effects. In engravings such as Bayham's Child with Leaf Ornament, a flat background, a three-dimensional ornamental flourish, and a shadow-casting figure coexist within a constricted space, while the Sistine ceiling, in Steinberg's words, is a battleground for local illusion, counter-illusion, and emphasized architectural surface, art turning constantly back on itself. From Steinberg's point of view, is George Braque's Fox, in fact, so revolutionary when placed next to these earlier works? Steinberg's print collecting may underlie one of his most important contributions to post-war American art, that of introducing the term postmodern and defining the work of artists such as Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns as conceived horizontally rather than vertically, as a flatbed picture plane. Since Jennifer Roberts will be addressing this same topic in the following talk, I'll keep my comments here brief. Steinberg's term is adapted from the flatbed printing press. Steinberg connected the bodily posture of manuscript illuminators bent over their parchment with printmakers carving into wood blocks or incising copper plates. Postmodern artists revived this scriptorial tradition by reorienting their work's angle of address from that of an upright body encountering an Albertian picture plane that is a window to the world, to that instead of a horizontal work surface registering operational processes and recording whatever information is transmitted by the brain of the city. Steinberg's astute observations of posture and gesture, coupled with his contemplation of the thousands of prints in his collection, objects which were produced and stored horizontally and were historically viewed in albums rather than framed on the wall, primed him to understand this reorientation from the vertical to the horizontal, this 90-degree shift from nature to culture in the art he encountered in New York at mid-century. In closing, as he began collecting in New York in the 1960s, Steinberg had the good fortune and aesthetic sense to discover and recognize high-quality, affordable works of art essentially on his doorstep. He also had the insight to recognize the art historical value of these frequently ignored sources of information, which, like Christ's genitals, were hiding in plain sight. Steinberg's image library was enriched by his collecting and study of prints that expanded his visual sources beyond canonical artworks. Just as prints circulated imagery among artists, they circulated ideas to Steinberg. And yet, while it is true that Steinberg's scholarship was greatly enhanced by his close encounters with the thousands of original works of art stuffed into his New York apartment, it is also true, as this poignant portrait of Steinberg by the contemporary artist Tacita Dean suggests, that the field of art history has long depended on printed reproductions. Whether in the form of engravings, slides, or photographs, prints are how most of us first encountered the objects of our study, and they are still the medium through which we most frequently engage with those objects. In these days of work from home and restricted travel, virtual copies stored on our hard drives and searchable on our computer screens are essential to our academic pursuits. How lucky, however, are the students at UT and others who come here for research that Steinberg's collection, defined by the eye and mind of this superlative scholar, is available for the next generation to access ad fontes, these primary sources on the history of the Western art historical tradition. And personally, as the overseer of our Julia Matthews Wilkinson Center for Prints and Drawings at the Blanton, I extend a warm invitation for all to come and discover, as I have, rich new avenues of research made possible by Steinberg's eclectic, exceptional, and expansive collection. Thank you.
So I think we already have a lot of juicy material here. I would like to remind everyone to please put any questions in the Q&A. We'll be taking those questions after Jennifer's talk. Jennifer, will you say hello for a second, please?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here. So Jennifer is the Elizabeth Cary Agassi Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University and Faculty Director for the Arts at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. She is an art historian with particular interests in material studies, print studies, and the history and philosophy of science. She's the author of numerous books and essays spanning American art from the 1760s to the present, including Mere Travels, Robert Smithson and History, and Transporting Visions, the Movement of Images in Early America. In 2012, she curated and wrote the catalog for Jasper Johns in Press, The Crosshatch Works and the Logic of Print at the Harvard Art Museums, which inaugurated her ongoing interest in print studies. This spring, she is delivering the 70th annual A.W. Mellon Lectures in Fine Arts for the National Gallery of Art with the series titled Contact, Art and the Pull of Print. We are very excited to jump into this talk, and I will get that going.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to talk today about Steinberg and his relationship to the flatbed picture plane. Now, I never had a chance to meet Leo Steinberg, but I wish I had. I wish I could have told him how much his work meant to me, how much he did for me as a young art historian trying to find some kind of a voice, some kind of a place in academic modernism. I can still remember exactly where I was when I first read his brilliant essay on Jasper Johns. I was preparing for my PhD oral exam, circa 1996, and with every paragraph I read, I felt years of the accumulated demoralizations of academic rhetoric lifting off of my shoulders. I was inspired by the vigor and the casual poetry of his language, by his cross-historical panache, and by his artistic training, the way he showed that making art makes you a better art historian. So I wish he were here because I have an awful lot to thank him for. But I also have some questions. I want to, as it were, press him on a few things, particularly this. In April of 2003, at the Blanton, on the occasion of his gift of prints that make up the present exhibition, Steinberg gave a lecture titled What I Like About Prints. At the very end, the climax of the lecture, he had this to say about Rembrandt's 1642 etching, The Raising of Lazarus. Whenever I commune with Rembrandt's little etching of the raising of Lazarus, watching the corpse heave its weight out of its coffin at the bidding of Christ, I'm joining 8 witnesses to a miracle, undisturbed by the thought that this scrap of paper had once hugged an inked copper plate under pressure, along with perhaps 50 others. He says, in other words, that when he looks at this print, he's transported. He witnesses a miracle, something transcendent, something remarkable, the image, we might say, coming to life. Why did he end with this? Well, he was in the process of arguing with Walter Benjamin about reproduction. Benjamin, of course, had famously claimed that reproducing an image would automatically destroy its aura. Steinberg rightly perceived this as an existential threat to anyone who cares about prints, so he wanted to assert that this little reproduction still bristled with aura, that it was still capable of emotional miracles. But he seems to say here that in order to feel the auratic power of this print, he needs to forget the very fact of its printedness. He needs to remain undisturbed by the thought of the copperplate and the ink and the paper and the pressure, or else that sense of astonishment would somehow dissolve. Undisturbed by the thought that this scrap of paper had once hugged an inked copperplate under pressure. Well, I am disturbed by this thought, by which I mean that I'm fascinated by it, compelled by it. And in fact, this is the aspect of this print that I am most interested in, this moment of matter under pressure. So this is kind of awkward. In many ways, my talk today is about trying to work through my confusion on this issue, because I truly believe that it was actually Steinberg himself who taught me to care about all this. Steinberg made me want to think about the physical mysteries of printmaking that he says here that he doesn't want to think about. Actually, it's really hard to look at this print without being reminded of its pressing. The print itself keeps pointing back to it. For example, this particular print is well known as something of a theological embarrassment because Christ is shown performing the miracle with his left hand. Rembrandt was castigated for this because, of course, all such divine errands should be performed with the right hand. Christ is shown correctly, however, on the copperplate where Rembrandt drew him with his etching needle. And here it is, by the way, the very same copperplate that was indeed once hugged by this scrap of paper. It is now at the MFA Boston. So Rembrandt drew Christ correctly there, his right hand performing the miracle as it should. And because Christ's wrong-handedness on the print is theologically irritating, we're compelled to want to think about reversing it. And when we do that, we find ourselves essentially thinking about the copperplate. Of all the various miracles evoked by this print, one of them is the miracle of reversal that is part of nearly every printing process. The miracle that happens whenever plate meets paper. Christ's hand calls not only Lazarus up from the grave, but it also calls back to that moment of contact. And then beyond this, there's the very subject matter of this print, a resurrection. A man, or at least an image of one, is raised up into the light from a dark, flat, slab-like space. It's hard to think of a better allegory for the flatbed printing press and the act of pulling a print up from its matrix. I'm especially interested in this gesture of the boy placing his hand just so on the oddly flat, oddly white rock, everyone looking down to see the miracle of the rising figure. It looks like nothing so much as a printer pulling a sheet of paper from the plate, a moment which in the print studio is also always gathered around and watched with a mixture of anticipation, astonishment, and marvel. It's like witnessing a miracle, this particular kind of resurrection, bringing the image to life after its simultaneous birth and entombment in the press. I don't know if Rembrandt intended this, but I do know that he spent a lot of time pulling prints from plates and no time actually witnessing people pulled from the dead. And I know that you really can't unsee this comparison once you've seen it. Basically, the body of this print rose up from a flatbed in a way that parallels the very rising that it pictures. This print is a kind of meta miracle. My point here is that you don't have to forget about the act of pressing in order to have access to that thing called aura, the wonder and strangeness of this scene. The act of pressing is where a lot of that wonder and strangeness originates. The raising of Lazarus is a resurrection, something astonishing, something beyond understanding, something that occurs in the human world but does not quite follow its laws of embodiment. Its divergence from normal human experience is miraculous, unsettling. I want to argue today that the making of prints in the crushing embrace of the press shares all of these qualities, and that although Steinberg didn't seem to want to see it here in this print, and although he didn't directly articulate it in his writings about print, his work gives us all the ingredients for pursuing this revelation. And I want to just tell you straight up where I'm going with all this, why I am pursuing this argument. In the vast majority of theorization and commentary in art history, the significance of print is taken to derive from its status as a technology of reproduction and dissemination. Print does work because it makes images multiple and mobile, and thus becomes a medium for synchronous communication between viewers that are separated in space and time. This basic idea, the idea of print as a moving idea, is what Steinberg emphasizes in his own notes on print as a circulating lifeblood of ideas, a method for the exchange of ideas between artists across the Alps or the Atlantic or even further. Print is taken as a kind of dematerialized transmission device for images, a mental museum, as he put it. There are two things that bother me about taking too monolithic an emphasis on this idea of print as transmission. One is that this looks for significance only to the downstream life of prints, to what happens after they leave the press, and doesn't think to explore the ideas that arise from and through the actual process of making them. Another is that in its emphasis on communicability, it tends to normalize and familiarize print. The more effective and efficient print is seen to be as a tool of communication, the more it accords with the light of reason and disputation and discourse, the less strange it seems as a thing in itself. The harder it is to see that print is in fact a very weird kind of artifact that's born from a moment of dark and mysterious contact, under intense pressure, born from a crush, from a drama full of gravitational and tactile intensity, with all kinds of strange bodily and emotional implications. Print is about this too, and if we focus only on its communicability, we miss the profound incommunicability and mystery at the heart of its making. Now, I think Steinberg actually sensed this, even if he didn't quite say it. Today, I want to look closely at his concept of the flatbed picture plane and try to pull out what it might tell us about his complex relationship to print. In a legendary lecture in 1968 at MoMA, Steinberg made a claim that was astonishing in its boldness and clarity, and that transformed the way people thought about 20th century pictorial art. He argued that at around mid-century, there had been a shift in painting so elemental, so powerful, that it was as if the Earth's gravitational field had suddenly pivoted 90 degrees. In painting, of course, at this time, subject matter had begun to re-enter an art world that had been dominated by abstraction. But something now was different. The picture plane for Steinberg had shifted its, as he said, angulation with respect to the human posture, so that it no longer mimicked or recalled a vertical window or wall that we might approach in front of us. Instead, artist after artist began to treat the picture plane as if it were something like the surface of a work table, a hard, opaque, flat plane that received subject matter as if it were supporting it from below. Whereas the former window picture plane was illusionary, based in visual optical experience, a memory or glimpse of something seen or once seeable, the flatbed picture plane was more like a receptor surface on which objects are scattered, on which data is entered, on which information may be received, printed, impressed. This flatbed picture plane posited a new and unfamiliar relationship between the human body and the picture plane, changing, as he put it, the angle of imaginative confrontation with pictures. Even if after being painted, such a picture hangs on the wall, we imagine looking down rather than across at it. It does not share our own vertical embodiment. This broke the gravitational hierarchy of the vertical picture plane, in which things on the top of a picture are somehow understood to be lighter or airier than things on the bottom. This now is a horizontal surface in which every element is meant to have the same visual weight. Also, visual logic has been replaced by a kind of cognitive logic. Things on this flatbed picture plane come to us not like illusions of things given in the world, but rather things to be subjected to organization, consideration, cognition, calculation. Steinberg saw this as a turn in painting from nature to culture, to a matrix of information, a flat documentary surface that tabulates information, and a space for operational processes. He gives this revolutionary new model of the image the name of the flatbed picture plane. And directly in the very first sentence, he attributes this to the example of the flatbed printing press. But oddly, his essay says almost nothing about the physical act of printing, the forcing of paper and matrix together under pressure, which is what the horizontal plane of the flatbed printing press is in fact designed to do. He does talk about print in the essay, but he discusses it as a form of subject matter rather than a form of object per se. When we look at a painting by Roy Lichtenstein, for example, with all its references to commercial printing, Steinberg points out that it doesn't remind us of the world, but instead reminds us of a flat piece of printed matter. We imagine that we're looking at a flat comic strip set on a table, rather than an explosive drama unfolding in three-dimensional space. Images that appear in this new art of the flatbed are like Steinberg's beloved prints spread out on a table. The flatbed picture plane is like a place for printed matter to come to rest, to be operationalized, like a switching station for the circulating lifeblood of ideas. Ultimately, Steinberg talks about the flatbed picture plane as more like a desk or a library table upon which prints rest than like a press in which prints are actually pressed. It's as if he has hauled a massive, heavy printing press into the room with us and then used it as a table to spread out finished prints, rather than for its actual purpose, to apply intense, crushing pressure in the making of those prints. What do we miss when we don't think about that pressure? I want to think about it for a moment, attend to what happens when a print goes through the press. What can we see and what can we say about the pressure that lies at the heart of all print? What happens when we let ourselves think about the copper plate hugging a scrap of paper under pressure? This is a former student of mine printing and etching, like Rembrandt's, on a roller press. I'll loop this video while I'm talking in a quite literal way about what is happening here and hinting at some of its implications. In printmaking, the print itself, in the last analysis, is not made by human hands, but by the press. To make a print is to enter into collaboration with the press, which is a non-human agent. Although it's not human, the printing press is a kind of sensitive, perceptual being. After all, it must sense the image on the matrix in order to print it. It does this by applying pressure evenly across the entire matrix, which responds to that pressure according to the chemical or topographical qualities of its surface, according to the incisions on a copper plate, for example. This is much closer to a tactile mode of perception than a visual one. Indeed, although the printing press is used for the production of visual art, it is not itself an optical instrument. If you want to print a visual image, you must first convert it into something that can be felt. The image has to be translated into grooves or ridges or viscosities. The press does not understand visual illusion, only raw physical facts. I like to say that the press takes everything literally. The printmaking process is akin to an act of communication with a blind alien. And printmaking is blind in another sense as well. The moment of printing is radically invisible. The actual formation of the print occurs in a tight, unobservable space. The print is made darkly. What happens there happens between the press and the matrix and the ink and the support. No one can watch it. No one can surveil it. The moment of creation, again, is fundamentally unobservable. This helps explain the mystique of the pull in printmaking, that moment when the image is peeled away from the matrix, revealing it to the eye and to the air for the first time. Once the print is pulled, it enters the luminal world of the visual arts. It's released into the light, into space, into the range of the optical. Now it can go on and become an idea to be transmitted around the world. Now it can be an illusion. Now we can back up and get a look at it. But when we do, we should not forget that we're always looking at a recording of a contact event that occurred beyond the range of looking. We're looking at the fossilized traces of a hidden, sequestered act of mysterious material perception. No matter how airy or spatial the image on the print might be, it is first of all a remnant of blind anaerobic contact. The print gives us the world as perceived by touch and pressure, and only then given over to the eye. Now, some of this does match up with what Steinberg says about the picture plane. It recalls what he says about horizontality and the even emphasis across the surface. It recalls his hints about the flatbed picture plane as being somehow non-visual or not visual in the usual way. But this goes further. When we really bring pressure into the equation, when we think of the flatbed picture plane as a real working press bed, we find ourselves confronting a model of the image that is more ponderous, blind, alien, and mysterious, in short, more disturbing than Steinberg lets on. It's an image with a kind of body that's charged with tactile energy, wobbling undecidedly between intimacy and violence. It's an image that unfolds from a core of total blindness. It's an alien image that cannot be fully known by its human collaborators, a strange and estranged configuration. And it's an image that is always haunted by its own belatedness, even ruination, as the trace of a past event that was never perceived and can never be fully recovered. Nothing about this prevents us from discussing print as an agent of humanist communications, as a tool for ideas and enlightenment, as Steinberg does. But it does suggest that we also need to take account of print as mysteriously formed forced matter, as something, and I use this word advisedly, as something like an incarnation. As I mentioned, I think that Steinberg actually did sense this about print, even if he didn't come right out and say it. This image of print, this disturbance, let's call it, lurks throughout his work as a whole, often most powerfully in his work on sculpture and painting, and informs his ideas about the flatbed picture plane. For Steinberg had already confronted something like this picture plane in the most challenging, mysterious, and erratic works of art that he had encountered, the ones that he returned to again and again to try to make sense of in his own writing. Like this one, Michelangelo's Pietà, so central to his scholarship, with its Christ figure splayed horizontally across the flat bed of Mary's lap, formed in an unknowable union of flesh and spirit, presented to us as an intimate aftermath balanced between contact and loss. In the little time I have remaining in this talk, I want to suggest that we can track the crush of print through Steinberg's writing on Rauschenberg, Johns, Picasso, and finally Michelangelo. First, Johns and Rauschenberg. Steinberg developed the whole notion of the flatbed picture plane by wrestling with the work of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. Most critics dismissed this work when it first emerged in the mid-1950s, but Steinberg really tried to meet it on his own terms. Rauschenberg's paintings are notable for the way they insist on pressure. He was really a connoisseur of pressure. Often he literally included pressed or crushed objects in his paintings. Steinberg noticed this. He mentioned that the shirt in this painting, for example, should be seen not as if it were hanging out on a line, but rather as if it were laid out for pressing. But Rauschenberg actually went even further than this, because this shirt is actually, not just imaginatively, pressed into the painting. Rauschenberg must have had to iron it down before finally adhering it to the surface. Here's another example from one of my favorite works of his, the 1974 fabric piece called Scent, which Rauschenberg made by running crumpled newspapers and bags through a printing press, so that pressure actually composes this work and makes itself visible as such. This is an image, by the way, of modernist flatness that is literally generated by pressure, rather than, say, by perspective or modeling. As for Johns, Steinberg writes at length with touching honesty about how devastating Johns's work was to him at first. He was disturbed by its blankness, its reticence, its alienness, its refusal to reveal itself. What's interesting is that in writing about what bothered him about Johns, Steinberg evoked many of the qualities of printing in the press that I described earlier, its alienness, its blindness, its unknowability. Steinberg found Johns's paintings to emanate, as he said, from a totally non-human point of view that was associated with sufferance. He responded very strongly to the emphasis on tactility over blindness in Johns's work. In fact, when describing what it was like to talk to Johns and puzzle through his work, he described it as being like being in dialogue with a questioner of ideal innocence and congenital blindness. The being to whom these paintings would make sense, in other words, would be, quote, a blind man who believes nothing that cannot be touched, end quote. In other words, this being would be like a printing press, feeling but not seeing the matrix, applying pressure to the whole idea of painting. Now, I've argued elsewhere that Johns's entire practice in every medium is based on his affinity for and experience with printmaking. Johns and also Rauschenberg spent enormous amounts of time making prints, working with presses, learning to think like a printer, and even, I would argue, learning to think like a press. Both Johns and Rauschenberg made paintings that were often literally printed using devices like stencils or screen prints. Both of them were fascinated by the mystery of reversal. Both of them insisted on sensory organizations based on touch rather than vision. So when Steinberg came up with the flatbed picture plane through his encounter with Johns and Rauschenberg, he was indirectly drawing upon the mystery of pressure in the press. Johns doesn't want to alienate his viewers exactly. As he puts it, he wants to make things that are free from the way he sees them. He wants to understand the world, in other words, from a different perspective. For Johns, the printing press provides access to a totally different way of understanding and a totally different mode of embodiment. Printing for Johns is ultimately a project of empathy, of coming to know a way of knowing that differs from one's own, to understand and even to cherish a different kind of body and a different kind of sensation. Rauschenberg was similarly open to other configurations of being, and both of them practiced this through printing. In other words, if the printing press was a device for communication for Johns and Rauschenberg, it was a device for communication with otherness and difference. It was an attempt to make contact with something beyond the everyday world of human knowledge and embodiment. Steinberg was also interested in this problem of communicating with otherness. He explored it frequently in his writing on earlier artists, particularly as it emerged in motifs involving, not coincidentally, horizontal figures laying on beds. One of his most famous essays was his essay on Picasso's Sleep Watchers, showing figures holding vigil over sleepers, pondering the state of their bodies and minds. Picasso's sleeping bodies laid out on their flatbeds are remarkable for Steinberg in their simultaneous corporeality and mystery. They're right there next to the watchers, but they remain radically inaccessible in their marginal states of consciousness. Sleeping and dreaming, they cannot be reached. They inhabit, as Steinberg puts it, a state of exile. These horizontal bodies are progenitors, I think, of Steinberg's flatbed picture plane in its fullest sense, as informed by and of print as something that always remains off axis, out of range of total knowledge or enlightenment. And finally, the great Pietà. Steinberg wrote extensively on this sculpture, which he called an interlude of disturbing beauty. This, too, I think, lies behind Steinberg's flatbed picture plane. First, there's the way in which the torque and slump of the dead Christ, the twist in the spine, the crick in the neck, captures something like the full force of the gravitational transitions that Steinberg had found in the flatbed picture plane that turn to a radical horizontality that no longer corresponds to natural life. And there's the fact that Christ is laid out as if on a bed, a flat bed, something that Steinberg repeatedly mentions, suggesting that the body maintains a posture of sensual release, akin to a figure on a fainting couch. Speaking of lapse, Steinberg made us see how strange and even scandalous this Pietà is in its eroticism. Michelangelo had depicted Mary as a young woman rather than a mother in order to convey in bodily language the theological idea of Christ as the bridegroom of the church. The figures, as Steinberg says, quote, enlace one another in a human love knot, end quote. The bodies seem consumed by what Steinberg called in his flatbed essay, emotional pressure. This is a theological argument given to us in the language of powerful, generative, emotional contact. Steinberg also notes some oddities in Michelangelo's rendering of the corpse of Christ. What, he asks, exactly is the condition of this body? He actually asked some medical students at UPenn whether it looked dead to them, and they basically said, no way. It had way too much muscle tone, and then there's the real kicker, these engorged veins in the arm. For Steinberg, the living veins convey the mystery of Christ's two natures as flesh and spirit. The flesh here is dead, the human part, but the spirit lives on. The spirit is still imprinted there in the flesh, impressed upon it. Christ is, as Steinberg says, quote, still warm from the incarnation. This is a body suspended in an uncertain state between human and non-human. It's a mystery embodied, a wondrous and disturbing thing that can be somehow both material and transcendent, both dead and alive. Let's circle, to conclude, back to the circulating lifeblood of ideas. This is Hendrik Holthuis's famous Farnese Hercules, a print that Steinberg owned. This print, with its Herculean veins and substantial muscle tone, coursed through the print networks of Europe as an idea. But it also had its own veins made from ink and darkness and pressure. Engravings have their own network of embossings made by the pressure of the press as it forces damp paper into the incisions on the plate. The paper is deformed by the incisions as it picks up ink, and it essentially gets cast into a standing reticulated network in the paper. These are the veins of a body incarnated in the press, in the dark, under pressure, under a regime of touch and contact, crush and release. They're instruments of communication, but in the end, their making is mysterious, incommunicable. Beyond the realm of the human, they challenge us to confront and, to use a term of Steinberg's, to cherish that which takes us beyond ourselves. As a collector, Steinberg had this very engraving in his hands. He felt the veins running through it with his own fingertips. And I think these veins run quietly, subcutaneously, throughout Steinberg's entire body of scholarship. And when we trace them, we can see that he has offered us new ways of understanding the significance of print. Thank you. That will be it for the recorded portion of this lecture.
Thank you both so much. I think we're going to get started for this Q&A section with a wonderful question from Leslie that is directed at Holly's talk, but then I would like to ping pong it to Jennifer after Holly responds. So Leslie says that she was struck by your comment that Leo was more interested in print subject over the quality of impression, which is really telling for his keen eye and art historical investigation. And she wonders if you could speak a bit about Leo's investment in the specifics of different printed media, so the different processes, and whether or not the various techniques involved in woodcutting, engraving, etching, lithography, etc., might have informed his understanding of copying, artistic transmission, and so forth. Sure. A lot there. She says, in short, can you talk to us a bit about prints as a medium and what that meant to Leo Steinberg? So I guess a little bit more about the semiotics of the individual print processes as opposed to the subject matter thereon.
Sure. Yes. Thanks for that question, Leslie. A few things just to note that Ginevra and I probably slip up. Well, it's not really a slip, but we call him Leo. We've been living with Leo for a long time. So if we talk about Leo, we're talking about Steinberg, but we call him Leo. That's a great question. And actually the first room in the exhibition is called The Language of Prints. And so that's where we look at the specificity of each type of printmaking. And in that talk that he gave at the Blanton that was republished as What I Like About Prints, Steinberg does talk about how prints are unique in that they reveal their method of construction, unlike any other artwork. Paintings obscure what's underneath, and at least sort of in the Renaissance, drawings weren't necessarily meant to be public, but a print was a finished object, and that you could, if you look at it really closely, you could see how it's constructed. And he did look really closely at his prints. The first pairing in the exhibition looks at an engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi and then a woodcut version after the engraving. And I was just amazed at how Steinberg writes about that. He notes that there are 7 types of marks that Marcantonio used. So he really is looking at that process of construction. And then when he looks at the chiaroscuro woodcut, he doesn't say, well, here's a second-rate copy of it in woodcut by a later artist. He says, here's an artist, and he always takes the side of the artist, figures out what is this artist trying to do? Why did he pick to do a woodcut? And he says he's kind of cleaning up the tangled webs of a medieval city and regularizing them. So he sees the inherent value or the beauty in creating that chiaroscuro woodcut. I'll just also say too, Steinberg's collection does include some multiple states of prints. He's not the kind of collector who wanted every single state of, if they were available, but I think he was interested in process to a degree. And if it was affordable and available, I don't think he went hunting for every single state, but if he found 4 states of the same print for sale, I think he was intrigued by that and would buy it. And then also just to say, in his ledgers, you can see he is buying what is affordable. He will note if an impression is wonderful. He will, so he does pay attention to impression quality in each of the media, but he just doesn't have kind of the budget or the inclination to just go for the best impression of something. So I do think that he, he's focused largely on, just in his scholarship, on art of, sort of Renaissance and Baroque. So he doesn't talk as much about kind of lithography or screen printing, but I think what is kind of amazing too about his understanding of printmaking and himself as an artist is the way that he was able to tie the art of the 15th, 16th century to the art of the 20th and 21st century. So he's looking at artists that we don't normally group together. He's looking at Melin and Goltzius and saying they have a system that was developed in engraving that someone like Lichtenstein or Close might come up with and use in screen printing. So he kind of sees across those media, but I think he also is very attuned to the special effects of each one as well. So kind of a complicated answer. And I think I also just put that comment in there because frankly, there are a few works that I put in the show that aren't considered museum quality. And you have to sort of justify, why am I putting this really poor impression on the wall, but it made an important point about iconography. So I just felt like I needed to point that out as well. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, I think your explication of Steinberg's sensitivity to the artistic process is really kind of at the heart of things. And to that point, Jennifer, I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I'm so enamored with the phrase, the crushing embrace of the press. And it does occur to me that different types of printing presses are used for different media. So especially in early modern Europe, often if you had a woodcut, you would be pressing it physically, like you would be rubbing it as opposed to running it through a printing press. So there are sort of layers of invisibility, whether it's the mechanical process of running an intaglio print versus that sort of more tactile version of directly rubbing the paper onto the block. And would you consider those layers of added or decreased invisibility part of the import that you've been discussing?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. And just while I have a moment here, I want to thank Holly so much for this tremendous show. This is just such an incredible exhibition. And I'm so sorry that I can't be down there to actually see it in person. So if you are anywhere near Austin, please get in to see it. So I would just like to sort of piggyback on Holly's point after the last question about imperfect impressions. And one of the great things about imperfect impressions is that they teach us a lot about how prints are made. Like if you want to understand the kind of decisions and problems that have to be solved in making a print, which is actually a quite counterintuitive process in many ways, it's often the imperfect impression that will show you how a print was made, because it kind of shows its work in a sense. So that's something that I really appreciate about Steinberg's collection. So in terms of pressure, that's a great question. And the way I think about it is that print is a medium that provides this expansive, layered, as you put it, vocabulary for thinking about pressure, an entire continuum of pressure. So on the one hand, you have the intense, like massive pressures that you get in a roller press. It's like 1,500 pounds per square inch, I believe it is, all concentrated along that line in the roller as it goes through the press. But on the other hand, you have, today screen printing, you have offset lithography, where the pressure is applied by a kind of rubber element. And often these very light impressions are actually called kiss impressions. So there's a continuum between something very light and intimate, like a kiss, all the way through to this crushing, violent pressure. And so print is a medium where artists can use that entire continuum to make statements about things like intimacy and violence, in ways that don't quite work with painting. And the relationship to visibility is, I think, a very, very interesting one. It is different to put your entire matrix, as I like to call it, print sandwich, your matrix, your paper, your newsprint, the blankets, put all that through the press and take it out again. A hand rubbing is going to be different. There's more spontaneity to it. You can apply different levels of pressure to different parts of the print at a time, but it is still very much a blind process. You can't, by definition, if you're printing a woodcut with the back of a spoon, you're still not able to see really what you're doing. So it's in some ways even more interesting in terms of the way the body of the printmaker is being brought into that process sensorially.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And thank you for bringing in sort of the violence of varying points of pressure. I'm seeing in the Q&A that Adele Nelson asked a very similar question. So you have addressed many of these points. Another question we have here is from Susan Dackerman. She asks, since the original moment of printed communication is blind and tactile, what is the role of pressure and tactility in the downstream, the time after the pull and the revelation of vision? Imagine Steinberg himself feeling the blood flow in Goltzius's engraving, but what about the rest of us?
That's a great question. And hello, Susan. By the way, Susan Dackerman taught me just about everything I know about early modern print. So I'm really glad to have her here. So I think that prints are a kind of sculpture because they're put through the press, because they are made in this moment of pressure. They're like two-dimensional sculptures. I like to think about them as being made in front and back at the same time. If you put a print through the press, you have all this pressure coming down from the top, but of course also counter pressure from below. And that is why you get this embossing or debossing. The paper becomes cast into as you say, itself a kind of tactile artifact. And Steinberg was terribly privileged to be able to have this kind of tactile access to his prints as a collector. It's an experience that most of us don't have, and even someone like me who goes into study rooms to look at prints, usually have to kind of hope that the study room monitor looks in the other direction, and I'll sometimes sneakily stick my hand under the print just to get a sense of its sculptural process. And that is something that tends to be lost, in an exhibition where you're going to look at something on the wall behind a frame. Frames and glass are terrible for looking at prints, and it also verticalizes them. So the tactile experience of them is key. And I mean, what I do to try to correct for that, and what I suggest to my students, is that whenever possible, you want to be able to get around and look obliquely at the print, get yourself into what I like to call critical lighting, so that you can see the relief, you can see the structure of the print. And if you allow yourself to rotate around the print, even if you're not able to touch it, you will be able to get a better sense of that sculptural quality. In many ways, like your typical museum JPEGs of prints destroy the experience of print because you can't get in and really see the way it's put together in space. This is why I'm a macro lens freak. Whenever I go in to a study room, I take these insanely close-up pictures because it gives you precisely that image of the tactility.
Yeah, and I would just encourage everyone here, if you don't already follow Jennifer on Instagram, please do, because those photos are incredible. And just speaking for myself, I will say that physical intimacy with the print itself is what sort of brought me into the cult of print culture. And I think probably that's what brings many of us here today. It is that like intense embodied space with this contact relic of artistic practice. Right. I guess to that point, and it looks like a few people were curious about the physical printing process and various relationships to different printing processes. But there was mention of the metaphor of printmaking. And Holly, I wonder if you could speak to this a little bit. Certainly in early modern Europe, as early as the 1400s with Cennino Cennini, there's discussion of printmaking being a metaphor for memory. So something is impressed on your brain. And that's sort of in contrast to painting, which is seen as almost too perfect to be a reality. So the metaphors with painting are often more ephemeral. Like it's so beautiful that it must be a painting because it's like too perfect for permanence almost, that has to be sort of a fleeting quality, which strikes me as kind of an inversion of the actual media themselves. Prints are often more ephemeral than paintings, but we have this idea that imprinted on our brain is more permanent. And do you have a sense, after handling so many of these objects and looking at them, just why printing is such a good metaphor and has evoked that permanent quality for people over the centuries?
Wow, that's sort of a poetic question. I mean, I do think there's just something very physical about these are small flat objects that you can hold, handle, collect in large, many. You put them into an album. You can create your own books. In a sense, you can curate your own subjects, collecting a whole group of landscapes or something, and it'd be much harder to do that with painting, right? So in a sense, you can, like Steinberg did, assemble your own library of images. So I think there's kind of a practicality aspect about it that worked for Leo Steinberg, but is historical. That's how, people collected works in albums. And so I think there's an information quality that's always sort of been attached to prints, whether that's fair or not, but it's seen as, factual eyewitness accounts that are much more quickly spread through print. And, people worked to make their prints seem more like evidence, eyewitness accounts, perhaps, I think, more than painting. So that's sort of a larger topic in itself. But I think there is something specific about the medium, as you suggest.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I would just, if I could I jump in on this?
Please, yes.
I think it's such a fundamental part of thinking about print, is thinking about how these metaphors of ephemerality and permanency get kind of stretched between different media. So print is often, there's a duality about print. Sometimes it's seen as ephemeral and virtual, this form of information that flits through space and flits across the world. But then it's also connected to these metaphors of impression and inscription and preservation. And this is also just true in terms of thinking about printmaking as something that goes along with print appreciation. So print, yes, it is virtual. Yes, it is transmission. Yes, it does circulate. It's very light in that sense, but then it is made heavily, right? I mean, it circulates lightly, but it's made heavily. It's flitting around the world, but in order to make it, you've got to have this massive press and put things under intense amounts of pressure. Printing presses are really heavy. Like, you have to actually reinforce the floor if you want to have a printing press. They would put, early modern printing presses were put in basements and at the first floors of buildings because they're actually holding the building up. So this is a really massive operation in every sense, as well as a virtual operation. And I think that's one of the things that Steinberg is sort of wrestling with. And why I think that the whole motif of the incarnation is related to print in his mind somewhere, in that it is this sort of word versus flesh paradox that's part of print, as well as all of this Christian iconography that he's so interested in.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so true. And I love this. I feel like we're giving a little homage to Elizabeth Eisenstein and the printing press as novel technology equal to movable type. I guess to that point, with the sort of technology of print and just the monumental nature of it, and I think you could both speak to this, though the question is directed to Jennifer. Laurel Garber says that she loves your discussion of the unobservable, private, and very much non-human moment of print creation in the bed of the press. But I find myself thinking about the student in the process video that you shared. We see them tinkering with the press, operating it, interacting with it. Could you speak a bit more about how you might think about the interaction between the inhuman and the human, the press and the printer, not to mention the printmaker, in the creation of a print? And that's related to a few other questions we've received from Eric Main and others.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think I would want to nest any such response to that in a discussion of just what happens to the artist's agency in the process of making a print, or being a printmaker, or working with printmakers. Print is one of those media where it is totally impossible to maintain any kind of notion of an individual genius artist figure who projects some like essential inner self onto the work. It's impossible to maintain the idea of an individual agent or a completely intentional mode of production with printmaking, because at every point, the artist's intentions, the artist's operations are being interrupted or placed into relation or into collaboration with other agents. Often those are other humans. If you're an artist and you go and have a residency at a print studio, you are working with printers and printmakers, experts, technicians, who are going to be changing your ideas as you work with that material and with that technology. Your work gets, your ideas get sort of delayed and deferred constantly. One of my favorite statements by Jasper Johns was when he talked about printmaking as like, how did he put it? Placing a long distance call through a long distance operator, or having a conversation through a long distance operator, because you'll do something and then you have to wait and do something else and you have to wait. You're constantly trading efforts and energies back and forth. What I think we're more able to see now in art history, where there's so much interest in material studies, in thinking about the agency of matter and technology, is that there's also the same kind of collaboration with a non-human agent, with the press. So it's not just that the press takes everything over. It is, in fact, a real collaboration, where as the artist, you're adjusting the press, but you're also adjusting your own actions to be able to work with this machine. So that's one of the things that's interesting to me about print and early modern print as well, is that it is, it's not just an early mode of communication, it's an early mode of thinking about human-machine interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Holly, do you want to respond, or otherwise I have another question for you?
No, please move on. Yeah, please keep going.
Yeah, just to respond quickly, I love the idea of collaboration is so integral, as Jennifer was describing it. There is a local Austin printmaker, Pepe Coronado, who has said that collaboration actually is the medium of printmaking. And I think we're going to see that over and over in these talks. What I think is interesting about Jennifer's last point too, though, is like, because there is that sort of like intangible moment where there's a little bit of mystery between the actual printing of the image and then the resulting lasting image. I do think of like William Ivins, and it is an exactly repeatable image. So there is a little bit of like precision at play as well. So even though the printing process does have multiple factors, there are variables, but there is also an exactitude. So it's sort of both of those things. Mm-hmm. And the multiple nature of print is so essential to that quality and this, the reason that we have these objects. And so we have a question from Cameron Manny for Holly. He wants to know, what about the multiplicity? How did Steinberg value that aspect, the fact that these are multiple identical images?
I mean, I would just say probably that it meant that it was spreading more widely, right? That more people were going to be able to see these, historically, that it's important that it's a multiple, that circulating lifeblood of ideas, that there's more opportunities for more people to see them, right? That it's not a single artist needing to go and travel to see another single artist's work, that they are now spread across Europe and beyond. One of the sort of chains of transmission that we traced in the exhibition starts with Marcantonio Raimondi copying Raphael and ends up in Bolivia in the 18th century in a painting. So I think multiplicity is what allowed that to happen. One looking at another, and then another print being created, and more thousands of those impressions going out. So I think from Steinberg's point of view, it would be that accelerating, circulating lifeblood. Yeah.
To that point, Jennifer, I mean, I think one of the striking things we see in the visuals you're sharing, especially with John's, like a remarkable innovation is the numbering of an editioned print series. How do you think that limiting of the multiplicity has a role in contemporary artists' relationship to printmaking?
Ooh, that's a really great question. So yeah, the whole question of the edition and the limitation of it, artists are, well, an example would be what Johns does with this whole idea. So Johns is very interested in kind of tracking editions and making sure that things are numbered properly, but he's also really interested conceptually in the idea of the cancellation. The cancellation and the cancellation prints is one of my favorite topics in print. And this, for those of you who don't know, if you're doing an edition of prints and you want to be sure to limit the number of copies that are made, you want to actually destroy the matrix so that it can't continue to be used to produce new prints. And that destruction is called a cancellation, and it usually involves going in and sort of literally physically either putting X's on a plate or in some other way making it impossible to keep printing the image. Johns would actually he started using that X as an iconography in his prints, and also sometimes in his paintings. So you would be getting an impression of a print made by Johns that has a cancellation mark in it that's really just there to allude to the whole problem of cancellation, the problem of turning off the spigot in a group of prints. And it's also something that's very important for printmaking in the later 20th century. It's in the early 1960s that we begin getting a kind of theorization of the print edition as a way of separating, or as a way of valuing prints and keeping fine prints apart from things like photolithography, the kind of prints you see in magazines. The Print Council of America does an entire brochure called What is an Original Print, I believe in 1961. And this is for collectors to help them understand what's like a real print that's been touched by the artist's hands, as opposed to something that was made in some commercial print shop. And this becomes a problem for people around 1960 when print technology begins really speeding up in the later 20th century. So the infinite edition is what makes, in many ways, print into the circulating lifeblood of ideas. But then as we get into the later 20th century, often the limitation of that capacity, of that edition, is seen to be somehow necessary to maintain the value of print.
So interesting. Yeah, a lot to think about. We're running down the clock. Would either of you like to say a quick closing comment?
Well, I just actually would love it if you could pose, there's a great question in here for Jennifer about Rembrandt and the Roman Pietà, and I'd love to hear what she has to say about that. So if you could.
Gosh, yes, thank you. Sorry, I didn't scroll down. Okay, Jennifer, your analysis of the Rembrandt and the Rome Pietà, this is from Peter Parshall. Pietà suggests the significance of gravity in the field and the flatbed metaphor. Gravity in both senses, serious and graveside. Prints, unlike paintings mostly, are flat and for centuries were looked at flat in albums and on tables. Mm-hmm. Do you think there is a general implication to this for print as a genre?
Absolutely, yes. And it's not just because of the horizontal way in which prints are looked at on tables, which is certainly significant. But also, again, this prints give us a sense of gravity in a more forceful sense. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at when I'm asking us to think about pressure in this horizontal flatbed picture plane. When Steinberg is talking about that pivot into the flatbed picture plane, when he's talking about changing the way we are essentially looking at the world, reordering it according to gravity, I mean, this is a really profound, extremely profound piece of insight, because the picture plane, however we think about the picture plane, it's the way we think about the world. It's the way we organize our relationship to the world. If it's a window, if it's a scrim, if it's a screen, if it's a flatbed, these are decisions that carry enormous cultural and social and political weight, and physical weight. And to think about that pivot into this unfamiliar and very powerful kind of gravitational understanding of the world, I think, it's a lot more than just taking a picture and taking it off the wall and putting it on the table. It's about rethinking our very bodily relationship to the world around us. So that's why that's one of the things that I'm most interested in about print, is that it changes the way our bodies relate to art.
Well, I think on that tantalizing note, we will wrap up the morning session. We do have one last comment in our Q&A that I will read off, as it's not a question. Andre Hayam says, according to many points in your discussion, we might also consider the paradox of Steinberg, so drawn to the great master and masterpieces in his choices of subjects for study, being also so extensively involved with a medium characterized by a kind of machinery and craftsmanship, features an artist like Durer himself perceived as working at cross purposes in his sense of his own identity. So I think we could continue unpacking a million threads here. But we are going to take a quick break just to remind everyone we will be reconvening at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. At that point, we will invite Patricia Emerson and Bernadine Barnes to give their presentations, which will be followed again by a 30-minute Q&A, next time moderated by Holly. So there's a lot to look forward to. In the meantime, there will be a slide with a link that will take you to that 360-degree virtual tour of the exhibition that Ray mentioned at the opening. So please feel welcome to check it out, enjoy, and we hope to see you back in half an hour.
Thank you.